Good evening. Tonight, it is my pleasure and privilege to stand before you to welcome you on behalf of the Kuwait Foundation for the Advancement of Sciences to this Speakers Series event. KFAS truly believes that science, technology, and innovation are the key factors to the successful development of Kuwait as a nation. Therefore, KFAS continues to invest in promoting ideas and concepts that drive profit in the Kuwaiti private sector. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to present to you Professor Neil Jones, Senior Affiliate Professor of Strategy at INSEAD, to tell you how you can develop strategies in your organizations to target threats and transform them into opportunities while adapting to changing technologies. Thank you. Professor Jones.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be invited to address you all here on my first visit to Kuwait. As you've already heard, my name is Neil Jones. I'm a professor of strategy at INSEAD. What you may not know is that I've been a resident in the region at INSEAD's growing campus in Abu Dhabi for about the last 7 years now. I am somewhat disappointed to tell you that this is the first time that I've had a chance to visit Kuwait. I'm delighted that KFAS has invited me here, and I've been teaching an executive program in strategy during this week. When KFAS invited me to give a short lecture, I was delighted to agree. And we decided that what the lecture should be about is something which is grounded in my area of research. That area of research is about technological change, which is, of course, completely consistent with the mission of KFAS that they've just outlined. More to the point even, perhaps, is that I'm particularly concerned with the impact of technological changes on the strategic performance of firms in industries, and in wishing to help firms make better strategic choices in the face of very complex circumstances which are created by technological changes. Our knowledge, unfortunately, falls a little bit short of the introduction. I will not be telling you how to unfailingly succeed during periods of technological transition. Instead, what I will be doing, by the way, I encourage you to be deeply skeptical of anybody who claims to be telling you that they know exactly what's going to happen at points of technological transition, even if they are very, very rich, which of course would give them some kind of credibility. There is no reason to believe that at this point we know enough to be able to tell you what's going to happen at points of technological transition. On the other hand, I think that we know quite a lot, and we know many different kinds of useful things. And so what I will be trying to do tonight is to give you some sampling of the kinds of useful things that we think we know. Also, to give you a sense of the limitations of what we think we know. So most of the theories that purport to tell you what's going to happen at points of technological transition are at best incomplete. Some of them are false. We don't completely know the difference between the two at times. And so what I'll try to do tonight is to introduce you to the broad field of study that scholars have been working on for quite some time. I will focus on what has turned out to be the single most popular and most famous model, which is the theory of disruptive strategy. I will try to link and illustrate the theories of disruptive strategy and other kinds of theories, which naturally are based on historical transitions, and try to link them to present-day transitions. Given what I've just said, the kinds of things that I tell you about what's happening for the evolution of digital technologies is necessarily speculative. And my intention is to raise questions, give you a sense of how the existing theories can help you think about and raise questions about what can and should be done at points of technological transition. But this will, as I'll show you, fall well short of being able to tell you exactly what to do. Nevertheless, during the course of the presentation, I will outline some different possible responses to technological change and try to give you some sense of what you would need to believe for these responses to be the appropriate responses. And what that is and how this would work, I hope will become clear as the talk progresses. At this point, my teaching at INSEAD has very little of this kind of communication, this one-to-many, standing at the lectern, is not something that we have been doing huge amounts of lately. When we work with and teach with executives, we try to get them engaged. We find that that's a much better way to help people learn. It also helps the professor say things which are A, not boring, and B, more useful and of interest to the particular people involved. This is not a great setup for back and forth, but if you have a burning question, don't sit on it, stick your hand up, and maybe we can inject some questions and some back and forth, which in many ways at this point is my preferred mode of communication in any event. Okay, so let me sort of introduce this whole area of thinking about technological change by listing or sort of enumerating different elements of what has been a long-standing puzzle in people who study industries and competition and technological change. And broadly speaking, what this area shows is that industries go through long periods where there are obvious, overwhelming incumbent firms who are dominant, right up until the point where they unexpectedly fail, often at points of technological transition. And so this is a long-established truism. Let me give you a few examples. The leading firms who made radios based on vacuum tubes were displaced by relatively simple radios based on semiconductor electronics. So the original Sony radio I'm showing you here. A study that I admire, which is not all that well known in the literature, shows that propeller-driven aircraft manufacturers were displaced by new firms who used designs which were based on the turbojet. Apparently, there were issues in making that transition. I'm mildly curious as to whether anyone in the audience knows what this even is. Yes, it may not be a good reason to be proud that you know what this thing is. It's a kind of indicator of a certain kind of past and a certain length of past. Yeah. So this is the kind of thing that technical nerds from the ancient times would use to make calculations. The people who made these slide rules were displaced by people who made the modern displacing equivalent. I presume there are people who know what the second picture is in the room, although we're already in danger of not even knowing that. Yeah. Less well known, there were major technological disruptions in the telephone industry around transitions from large electromechanical switches, which is what you can see in this picture, to this picture, which is all electronic stored program control computers. I'm going to come back to this example a little bit later in the talk. Some of you know what Blockbuster Video used to be. There's a few more people nodding heads at this point. Some of you knew what Borders, some of you have heard of what a physical bookstore used to be. Many of these firms were wiped out primarily as a result of technological changes. I am a Canadian. BlackBerry is some kind of Canadian tragedy story. We went from gigantic gloating success to an ignominious failure in probably 10 years, maybe 12, because of the rapid pace of change in the handphone technological industry. Right now, Uber is threatening. This is a picture of the French reaction to Uber's entry to Paris. Not surprisingly, the French went on strike. That's still a kind of go-to response. They frequently do. And we'll come back to that. That actually works as a strategy also. It in fact, might be as good as anything as a way to respond to technological change in terms of its effectiveness. The last thing I want to put up here is speculative. And I'm doing this somewhat mischievously and speculatively because this series of events, this displacement of seemingly strong, long-lasting, established incumbent firms failing, is not likely to end. And so one possibility is that General Motors is just about to fail. This is not simply idle speculation on my part, although it is speculation. We did some projects when MBAs came to the region last year for General Motors. They are seriously worried about combinations of autonomous vehicles and ride-sharing applications like Uber, which we'll also come back to, radically changing the car business. And so many different kinds of firms currently are under threat from different kinds of technological changes. So there's a long tradition in economics of studying these things. Probably the single most famous, maybe even more famous than Clay Christensen, although as people age, I suspect that will change. Probably the single greatest proponent of trying to understand this phenomena is a guy named Joseph Schumpeter. Joseph Schumpeter was a Harvard economist, an Austrian, and an emigre. He was modest in the way that Harvard professors are, which is to say not modest at all. One of the things that you hear about when you're studying at Harvard is that Schumpeter at one point told his students, "In my youth, I wished to be a great economist, a great horseman, and a great lover, but only 2 of the 3 were granted to me." Schumpeter is a tremendous writer and a tremendous phrase maker, but he, in a certain way, writes in an overly complex way. Therefore, I have highlighted the main elements of the quote here. Essentially, what he argued is that competition from new technology, which strikes existing firms at their very foundations and their very lives, is the heart of capitalism. And so this phenomena that I showed you with various examples on the previous slide was already well known to him in the 40s and even the 50s when he was writing. As I said with my speculative GM example, I don't think we're at the end of the process yet, even though I hope by the end of this talk at least you'll think that we know something about this and that we can manage it probably better than we previously knew how to do. So some of you may have heard the famous phrase creative destruction. This is coined by Schumpeter in this book, this most famous book of his. Well, this is a not so interesting slide, which is meant to help characterize some of the broad strands of research which have gone into trying to understand this basic problem or idea. And the most common set of causal mechanisms is that you expect that incumbent firms are going to continue to do well regardless of technological change. At least most people do. Most people find it surprising that there's mass failures of firms at some points of technological transition. If we had more time, I might poll the room. I have the sneaking suspicion that you guys are less surprised than previous generations have been because you're already used to decreasing life cycles of firms. But existing organizations have lots of advantages, which they tend to be able to use during all points of technological transition. They have, for example, brands. They have existing customers. The list could go on. They almost always, for example, have the ability to raise cash that is often superior to others. They have manufacturing facilities. They have sales and distribution organizations. They have credit facilities with suppliers and a variety of other kinds of advantages, most of which seem daunting to most people who are thinking about starting up a business. So the fact that at some points of technological change there is a mass failure of all these firms that seemingly have these great advantages is something of a puzzle, and lots of different scholars over a long period of time have been working on this problem. The solutions to this problem, or the kinds of things which people put forward as the reason for this, are in many ways intuitive and fall into two basic kinds of buckets. One is that for some reason, and we'll get into some of those reasons in a moment, although we'll by no means exhaust them in the amount of time that we have available, but for some reason, incumbent firms systematically make the wrong decision at points of technological change. And so when we come to it, disruptive technological change itself is one of these kinds of theories. It says that firms make the wrong decision systematically under certain circumstances, and because they have made the wrong decisions, they perform badly. The implication, therefore, is, an implication that I will ultimately question this evening, is that if they had made the right decision, they would have been fine. What leads us to potentially doubt that is that there is another stream of research that focuses on the capabilities of incumbent firms. And what this essentially says is, look, there may be something about what firms already know how to do that gets in the way of being good at a new technology, even if firms make the right bet about what technology is ultimately going to dominate. Yeah? And so we'll be exploring those two things. The most famous theory, and the theory which dominates the field, is really around number 2. And there are other theories in that as well. And so what I'm going to start out with is spending a bit of time helping you understand the theory of disruptive strategy. So some of you will probably know that in about 1996 or so, Clayton Christensen wrote a book called The Innovators Dilemma. I was on the campus of the Harvard Business School at that time, and in fact, Clayton Christensen was on my thesis committee. None of us, including him, had any idea that this thing was going to turn out to be as big and famous as it turned out to be. And so this I know for a fact from the inside. So to some extent, this is a surprising story, not just because it describes a surprising phenomena, but also because nobody knew that this particular theory, out of all the other particular approaches to this, was going to be so famous. I don't think it's an accident. I think this theory turns out to be incredibly useful. But the fact that it's incredibly useful can lead us to overgeneralize and believe that it's true in all cases, when I'll be trying to convince you that that's probably not the case. So what this theory is all about is the relationship between different computer generations and their disk drive suppliers. So IBM dominated in mainframes during part of this story. It had 14-inch disk drives. Mini computers were introduced. Those had 8-inch disk drives. Then the PC was introduced, and those had a different format disk drives. And what is interesting about the data set that Clayton Christensen analyzes is that systematically dominant producers of 14-inch drives, who were the most systematic, or who were the most sophisticated technological players, were displaced by the next generation 8-inch disk drive players, who were initially just poor and substandard. And then the same thing happened again with 5.25-inch drives and 3.5-inch drives. And so what Christensen did was to make sense of how this could have happened at all in the case of the disk drive, and then to create a fairly general theory or set of explanations for why this kind of thing might happen in other situations and in the future. and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. So this all seems very easy when you've seen it 100 times, and in fact, I was surprised when I went through this talk a little bit earlier how long it took me to explain this, and hopefully I won't screw it up by skipping steps, so let's see how I go. So Christensen's explanation focuses on thinking about how different sequences of disk drives are developed over time, which is going to be represented on the x-axis. On the vertical axis is hard disk capacity. And hard disk capacity is a measure effectively of the sophistication of the hard drive producer, and relates to things like not only how big the disk is, but also how small you can write individual bits. That's closely related also to how quickly you can read and write individual disks on the drive. And so there's a bunch of performance parameters which are closely related to this hard disk drive capacity. So the story starts out with the mainframe, and IBM's mainframe needed certain levels of storage. Over time, like in most PC systems, the levels of storage required increased. First, because there were more programs. Second, because the capacities of the computer themselves were increasing, and therefore reading and writing was necessary. Often more data was being crunched, and so more needed to be stored, and so forth. The red lines here represent how each different generation of computer, the rate at which each generation of computer needed to increase its disk drive capacity. Yeah. Before very long, in the computer industry, a smaller and inferior computing device appeared, and that was mini computers, which were pioneered by DEC. Initially, when mini computers come in, nobody is quite sure that they're going to be deeply useful, and they are therefore risky to make disk drives for. Moreover, they're not that profitable to make disk drives for because these things are selling themselves as cheap computing capacity, and so there are big price pressures on anybody who sells to these guys. And they don't need as much storage performance as the bigger computers. So in a sense, if you think about the way you're going to add value is because you're going to add value to bigger drives with more technology, that's not the right place to focus. So the 14-inch technology was the original supplier for IBM mainframes. This was an internal IBM group, and they were extremely sophisticated. It turns out that technological progress in disk drives was such that storage capacity could be increased year on year in disk drives even faster than computers would need it. And that turns out to be a key piece of the story that Christensen ends up telling. So if you think about this time period, mini computers are just starting out. They don't need anything like, I've got one of these, I got the most fantastic laser pointer I have ever seen. I'm a little bit afraid I'm going to burn a hole in the screen with it. So at this time, what mini computer manufacturers need is much less in the way of storage price performance than what's already in mainframe computers, and much less than the leading edge 14-inch disk drive manufacturers can, in fact, create. And so naturally, in order to add the most value with their technology, people who are making 14-inch disk drives are more interested in selling to larger high-end applications like the supercomputers of the time and so forth. I can't resist observing the supercomputers of that time were almost certainly less powerful than this. And so a small startup firm that effectively had low and much less effective technology started to serve the mini computer segment, and they made 8-inch drive technologies because the same capacity wasn't required. It's actually cheaper and easier than to build 8-inch disk technologies, and the 14-inch disk guys didn't care a bit about that. What happens next is, of course, that the 8-inch disk drives guys can start to make rapid technological progress. It turns out that part of their progress is related to the volumes that they can produce. And one of the things that's nice from that point of view for them is that there are a lot more mini computers than there are mainframes. And so they get economies of scale in manufacturing these things that many of the other guys don't get. And therefore, they are before long able to satisfy the needs of the IBM mainframes. So while that's going on, there's this new thing that comes out that nobody thinks is going to be very important and is a kind of risky child's toy. It's the thing called the personal computer. IBM eventually gets into this, but only after others have said it. And IBM PCs and other PCs of that time, the same story goes on. At this point in time, what PCs need in the way of storage is much less than what you need in mainframes and very much less than the 8-inch technology guys are working on. They're working on breaking into the incredibly lucrative mainframe market. And so, again, a small risky market is ignored, and 5 1/4-inch disk drive suppliers come in. Guess what happens in the next generation? The same thing happens again. The 5 1/4 guys are busy trying to break into mini computers. Meanwhile, I put this in for sentimental reasons. I actually owned this laptop. I still remember the left side low back pain that resulted in carrying this thing around the campus. And that thing had 3.5-inch drives. 3.5-inch drives could also be improved much more rapidly. And so in the end, 3.5-inch disk drives end up displacing the whole stack of previous people. So what we see here is in generation after generation, relatively small technological differences are leading to mass displacement of leading edge incumbents on a cycle of, I now forget what the time cycle here was, but it's on the order of maybe 5 years. So this is very, very rapid stuff. In fact, at the time, people were saying it was good to study the disk drive industry because they were the fruit flies of the technology industry. So Christensen, out of this, drew some conclusions. His conclusions were disruptive technologies are simpler, cheaper, and lower margin because selling to each of these new generations of low-volume, risky things that were being sold at lower price points in the market required much cheaper, simpler disk drives. They're first commercialized in emerging or insignificant markets, as each of these new computer markets were during the period when they first were introduced. Existing firms are most profitable customers don't want and can't use initial product of disruptive technologies. In other words, the 5 1/4 guys, when they go into PCs, don't have many computer manufacturers as a target because there's no chance that they could meet their needs. The last stage is that later disruptive technology firms displace the incumbents because they can use volume in the lower end segments as a basis on which to learn and improve faster, and therefore they go up and displace existing incumbents. So some kind of mass disaster happens, all the incumbents follow the same strategy, and somehow heedlessly go off the competitive cliff is the essence of this thinking about disruptive strategy. Well, you may or may not be interested in the question of why this got so famous, but most likely the reason it got so famous is that Clay Christensen got invited to give a lunchtime talk at Intel, and he didn't go through this incredibly complex story that I just gave you. He instead told a different story, and the different story was about steel mini mills. I don't know if any of you know what steel mini mills are. But steel mills, at least at the highest quality levels, relied on integrated mills that start with iron ore, put in energy, and so forth, and make the highest quality steel. There's a second method that can be used that uses high proportions of scrap. It's much lower scale and at least initially produced only very low quality steel. When they first were introduced, the integrated mills decided that the lowest quality steel, which was rebar, wasn't worth fighting over. This was already low margin business. It was very hard to add value. They didn't care about quality and so forth. And so they conceded this end of the market to the mini mill producers. Next stage is that the mini mill producers, having gotten cash flow, incremental experience, and learning from being in rebar, then got good enough to move into the next market for angle iron. Same logic applied, and then gradually steel mini mill producers began to intrude in really the core markets of the integrated steel mills. And when Andy Grove saw this, he said, you know what? This is the same as microprocessors. Now, that's a hell of a leap, I have to tell you. But Grove had a specific story in mind. The same thing he felt had just happened to Intel in semiconductor memories. Andy Grove himself and most of the top Intel leadership team at the time believed that Intel needed to be in memories in order to protect the microprocessor business. But internal decisions which were allocating capacity away from memory products and towards more profitable microprocessor products, Grove was afraid had created exactly the same kind of issue inside semiconductors. So he publicized this inside Intel, and most likely the reason this became so famous is that Grove started to promote this idea in Silicon Valley. So having introduced this whole idea, what I'd like to move on to now is to point out some what I consider to be limitations of this theory. And I'd have to say these limitations are not intended to be a criticism of the theory itself. Rather, the overly enthusiastic, I would say, interpretations of people who hear this theory. And so I just want to call your attention to a few things which I will follow up on in some more detailed examples, some of the ones around digital disruption now, which are, of course, more speculative. One is, just because you let somebody in the low end, does that really mean that they're going to have an advantage later in moving up? Is that always the case? Is that some kind of law of physics? Or is that just a bunch of examples where it's happened? It's certainly possible. That doesn't mean that it's likely or in any sense guaranteed to happen all the time. Second thing is that there may be other kinds of technological threats that don't follow this logic. In other words, this is one way to lose, but there may still be other ways to lose. And in fact, most of us believe that there are still other ways to lose as well. In other words, disruptive technology is one dynamic, but only one of the ways that this can all happen. And then the third question relates to the capabilities piece that I talked about earlier, which is, imagine everybody learns the theory of disruptive technology and proactively takes the position that we're not going to concede that lower market no matter what, because, we know what's going to happen after that. Do we then know that incumbents actually win? Or do they just get on to the next set of problems? Yeah. So I want to sort of illustrate some of these things. The night driving metaphor here is meant to say that disruptive technology shines light on certain areas, but there still remain areas of darkness. It's always bad when you have to explain your metaphor, but I just looked down there and said, why did I put that there again? You probably don't know. Okay, so what I want to do now is just quickly and crudely characterize a couple of digital disruption technologies, things that are happening now, and use that as a way of talking about what disruptive technology theory tells us, and also what it doesn't tell us. Because as I told you right from the beginning, there's no pretense here that it tells us everything that we necessarily need to know. Saying what digital disruption is really all about is a complicated matter. So I'm just taking an example from fintech, and I discovered this afternoon that the Federal Reserve had a position on what the technology behind fintech was, so that's as good an authority as there probably is. The Federal Reserve in the U.S. says that fintech is based fundamentally, first of all, on mobile technologies. Second, on the potential to have very, very large amounts of useful data and information, much larger than has traditionally been the case even in information-intensive banks. And then the third thing is APIs, which most of you probably will not have heard about, but are related to allowing programs to share large amounts of data and to interface. So it's a way of putting together clusters of working programs so that you can, in effect, create new and different kinds of data and computing capabilities. So in banking then, and digital banking or fintech, which is a big deal, and there's actually in our offices in Abu Dhabi, in our office complex, there's a big Abu Dhabi complex which is looking at various kinds of fintech startups. It's a big long-term trend. One element of this fintech revolution is all the computing power that we're carrying around nowadays with mobile, and it's not just computing power, it's connected computing power. A second big element is Amazon Web Services and the other scalable computing spaces that allow you to set up and buy relatively sophisticated and large capacities of things scaled to your needs. This is a tremendous breakthrough for people who are trying to do things on the web. You can stand on the back of what's already been done for online banking, various kinds of authentication systems and networks for the transfer of payments and so on. And so these basic elements are already in place, allowing lots of innovation to start happening in fintech. Of course, there's much more, and this is not attempting to be a complete solution. The blockchain is not in this thinking, but is in most other discussions. So what does this mean? I kind of like this chart from McKinsey & Company. What they did was to look at fintech startups all around the world and then classify what those fintech startups were actually trying to do. They looked at them on two different dimensions. Dimension number one is what part of the banking landscape are they trying to look at, which customers, corporates, small, medium businesses, or retail and consumers, and then what parts of the banking industry, account management, lending and financing, payments, and so forth. The back row is retail banking. And you can see that a tremendous number of those startups are there, and they're in what is effectively the simplest part of the value chain, which is around payments and to some extent leasing and financing. Yeah. So what should we expect to see around a phenomena like this? Let's imagine that fintech is going to be a disruptive technology. How would you expect incumbents to react? Well, one way to think about it is that incumbents are likely to try to apply new technologies to their existing high-end customers. Why? Because those are the customers who place the greatest value on banking services, and being able to create products and services for them is a little bit like creating computing power for the dominant mainframes. I was lucky enough to find some data in Turkey, and so I'll show you what that says in a second. An alternative way to think about this is that you would approach this disruptively. What does that mean? Well, it means that you would focus on relatively marginal, low-profit customers with simple or simpler kinds of solutions. If you look at the landscape in Turkey around 2015, which is where I found a case, the major large banks in Turkey were all deploying fintech in their existing services, often at the highest ends for customers who had the most complex transactions, and also tended to be using it in the back office. I've done some work in Saudi and in the UAE with banks, and that kind of framework is consistent with how they've been doing things as well. The second piece is that there are other entrants who are focused on the unbanked and people who have who are the least profitable bank customers. By the way, it won't surprise you to know that those turn out to include students. The smaller banks in Turkey tend to be clustering there, as did some other banking entrants. This thought experiment also brings up another important kind of issue, which is in a highly regulated market like banking, you can't simply have outsiders coming in, or at least not in most markets. You have to have a banking license. And so to a certain extent, the presumed dynamics of disruptive technology can't really play out in these highly regulated markets, and so we already need to modify the theory of disruptive innovation just for that. Yeah. This, however, is a not bad fit, I would say, for the theory of disruptive innovation. The next step for disruptive innovation would be to guess what the rate of improvement of these fintech services could be. To what extent can they create and add new value to different levels of customers? And then to what extent do the customers really need to take these things up? One possibility is that this plays out exactly the way it played out in disk drives, and that the guys who are now entering with students and relatively unprofitable banking customers will hold on to these customers, retain advantages, and sell ever more sophisticated services to them, displacing the banks at the top. If you talk to bankers in this region, and so in Saudi and the UAE, I've done it, for example, not in Turkey, they have the opposite vision. What they believe in the leading banks is that they are perfecting the technology now at the high end, where there are customers who are willing and able to pay for it, and they're going to be better at it and be able to roll down and displace these low-end guys. And there's nothing that tells us for sure that that direction of causation couldn't happen. There are markets where you learn most at the high end, where people can afford more, and then you gradually learn to move down. So there's something of a question mark about what's going to happen here. Digital disruption, or the theory of disruption, doesn't guarantee us that this is really going to happen here. Let me try another example. Uber. And Uber uses, not surprisingly, some or many of the same things that fintech is using, especially Amazon Web Services and mobile devices, as well as some of these payment solutions. They've got something extra, which is sophisticated algorithms that you can just buy and encompass in your organization now that do things like dynamic pricing. This used to be the preserve of the world's largest computer systems. So Sabre Systems in the US used to do this for airlines, and this was a rare and exclusive thing. It now sits out there as capabilities that you can buy and incorporate through various of these APIs. And then another tremendously sophisticated tool that is just out there for you to grab and use is the whole set of things around geolocation. Geolocation is incredibly valuable for scheduling pickups and allows you to allocate demand much more effectively and efficiently across widely dispersed resources like cars and taxis. And so Uber is another digital business. Let's see how Uber's strategy does compared to what disruptive strategy would predict. Uber, by the way, I don't even know why this is, but Uber's original business plan, the original PowerPoint presentation, is up on the web. It's awesome. It's just so much fun to actually find this thing. So we don't necessarily know what everybody really believed, but we know what they wrote down for the pitch to the investors in the presentation, so that's what I'll go on. What they said in this presentation, I've highlighted it, this yellow I added, but the rest of it's original. Uber will be faster and cheaper than a limo, but nicer and safer than a taxi cab. Does that sound to you like they're going after the low-end, originally unprofitable customers? Not to me either. If you look at the overall market they said they were targeting, it's the absolute core of the existing taxi market. Moreover, they're not going to second-tier American cities. They start in New York and San Francisco. That is not exactly the periphery of the industry. If you look at the kinds of stuff they had out there, Uber versus taxi, it looks like they're making a pretty direct comparison. Yeah. So if we go back here and look at our criteria for what disruptive technologies do, disruptive technologies are simpler. I don't think so. I think this is a lot more complex, although the complexity is in the technology and not in people and systems. Not first commercialized in emerging or insignificant markets. This is going right after the core, right from the beginning. And existing firms' most profitable customers don't want and can't use the initial product of disruptive technologies. That's not true either. So Uber is not disruptive, but if you're a taxi company, it's one hell of a danger. And I've already told you, General Motors is worried about stage 2 of Uber. So the theory of disruptive technology, in a sense, is incomplete with respect to some of the things that we see going on in the digital economy. And digital disruption only works as a name if we expand the meaning of disruption, which, by the way, is something that's already happening, that what people mean by disruptive is now much more flexible than it was. There's one more example. I thought it might be new to you, but people brought it up spontaneously at lunch, so now I'm sorry I put it in, but it was too late to turn back. So at one point, Kodak was a disruptor in that it introduced a tremendously cheap basic camera, and then it built one of the world's most profitable businesses around selling film to the people who cheaply could produce photographs because of Kodak's cameras. So Kodak was a tremendously profitable business. By the late 20th century, it was one of the most profitable organizations in the world. And then this happened. This is the Sony Mavica, which is the first ever all-electronic camera. This, in fact, was inferior to Kodak's camera. The quality that you could get for a TV picture for this, for a picture for this was quite low. You couldn't print it onto film. You could only look at it on television. But Kodak saw this and ultimately responded. Here's what they did. Unlike what disruptive technology predicts they might do, which is to retreat upmarket to more profitable things, over the next 10 years, Kodak spends $5 billion in digital photography. In so doing, it, at least in the minds of top executives reflecting later, in so doing, it hastens the end of the film market, partially by legitimizing digital, and partially because it stopped investing in the film business as much as it probably otherwise would have, because it ain't that easy for companies to be scraping up $500 million a year to be investing in things. Almost certainly during this period, these investments caused them to have a decreased lead compared to their main competitor, Fujifilm, who all throughout this period made significant competitive gains on Kodak. But by 2012, Kodak had achieved the following. Now, this story doesn't fit the digital disruption story very well. First, because Kodak does not simply allow people to take the low end of the market with an inferior camera. And second, because despite the fact that it spent absolutely staggering sums, it produced almost nothing in the way of real business value. It produced, by the way, lots of really good technology and patents that other people are happily using now. So this wasn't a complete loss for society or anything. And I'm not indifferent to that in any way. But this behavior is very, let us say, anti the disruptive technology story. So I don't think we have enough time to really spend a lot of time on this. There is a very, very complicated theory that has been developed around this by my former colleague Mary Tripsas and others. The essence of it, though, is as follows. So the puzzle they're trying to solve is, how can it turn out that on the one hand we take this thing seriously enough that we spend $5 billion on it, and on the other hand we end up with so little from it? And what they appeal to is some very sophisticated cognitive psychology, which I think is interesting. I also think the jury's kind of out on this because it's not at all clear that individual cognitive psychology ought to apply to the complex decision processes of many people working in a large organization. But let me just quickly sketch what this explanation looks like. It basically says, first, Kodak framed this thing as a threat. And framing matters a lot. When things are framed as threats, people care about them more. They respond stronger emotionally. And this can be shown in not one, but literally hundreds of studies for which Kahneman and Tversky recently won a Nobel Prize. The way this works is, to understand what this is saying, this is the sort of classic diagram. Along this axis is the real financial consequence, and this is how much you value a positive. So this is a negative and a positive of equal size. This is more or less about how much emotional reaction there is, how much you end up caring about these things. And what it says is that for a positive, you value it less. That is, there's less movement upwards than there is downwards. So what this is interpreted as saying is that people care more about losses than they do about gains, and that we instinctively do this. And if something is framed as a loss, if we think we're going to lose something, then we care about it much more, we're willing to invest more. What goes along with this, ironically, is another finding from social and individual psychology, which says up to a certain point, caring more is helpful for learning. Beyond that, people get rigid. That is, they jump to solutions, they try to do things too fast, and when they do things fast, they invoke old routines and old habits, is the essence of this. And so the interpretation here is that something like that might have been going on at Kodak. Yeah. This last piece is another kind of explanation for what's going on at Kodak, but a different one. I have to say that this research is a favorite of mine. And having said that, I should confess that it's because I did it. So what this was about was looking at the transition from electromechanical stored program control switches. This is what telephone central offices used to look like. And these were all moving parts switches. When you dialed a number, I keep forgetting I'm not pointing for you there. When you dial a number, one of these things would spin and or move up and down. And cascades of numbers would create a different pathway through all these various machines. And so we could do automatic dialing. This stuff was all replaced with the electronic version. And this doesn't do it justice because the electronic version is probably a 15th of the size. This stuff, you have to have the upper stuff. This is big, heavy metal. You've got to have special reinforced rooms. There are all kinds of operational things that go with it and so on. And so during the transition from these electromechanical things to the all-electronic things, it was a big change for incumbents. So my idea was, look, the nice thing about this industry was the incumbents were big and stayed in for a long time. They didn't, at the first moment of competitive disadvantage, they weren't put out of business because they had too much money to go out of business. And so I studied the product development effectiveness as a proxy for technological capabilities of the incumbents, which are in red, and the entrants, which were in blue. And so what this says is that during the early stages of this technological transition, incumbents were systematically worse at introducing the new technology. Probably for two different kinds of reasons, probably. One is that they took on much more complicated development projects and tried to do more because they had existing customers, and the entrants tended to be focused. That's a little bit like the disruptive technology story. The second thing is some of what they knew was right, and some of what they knew was wrong, but they didn't know which was which early on. And so early on, they had a disadvantage. As time went on, they became systematically better than entrants, because entrants had a different kind of problem. As the scale of development projects got bigger, entrants had to learn how to run complex projects, how to create a culture that allowed engineers to talk to one another, and so forth. That wasn't so easy to do either. But the end result of all this is that there's no particular reason to believe that just because you make the right strategic choice, all your problems are over. You could be like Kodak and waste $5 billion somehow, or you could even behave probably as well as can be done, like Northern Telecom, the Canadian telco companies in here, AT&T and so forth, who gradually adjusted over time, but it was not an easy process. In other words, there's much more here than the strategic decision. Yeah? So what should we do about all this? You'll be glad to hear this is the last stage of the talk, and I think I'm more or less on time. I committed to about an hour. I think that's where we are. Guess what? There are lots and lots of books out there that tell you what to do. And so I feel like I have to do some version of that. What I'm going to do, though, is slightly different. I'm going to tell you a set of things that you could consider doing and encourage you to think about the circumstances under which those would be the right thing. I don't know, and to my knowledge, no one else knows either, whether those set of circumstances would actually apply in any given particular situation, hence the dilemma. Question? Oh, you're taking a picture, sorry. Yeah, well, I don't want to get too personal, but I need cataract surgery, so I can't see very well out there. Okay, so here's my first strategic recommendation. The strategic possibility: don't change a thing. Now, there is a lot more support for this kind of approach than you might think. Let me give you some idea. First of all is the Kodak story, right? Not doing anything and going out of business without spending $5 billion with no return is better than spending $5 billion and then going out of business. Yeah? Moreover, it may be true that you're not the natural place for the new technology. And from a society and shareholder point of view, you're better off not wasting the resources that would try to get you to do that. Yeah? There's still even more good news, which is if I had more time, I would point out to you, even though we have all these examples where incumbents fail, the number of times when incumbents thought they faced threats compared to the number of times when incumbents actually fail is there are many more times you're facing threats or potential threats than actual threats. And so if you're looking for a rule of thumb, I think presume everything's okay is going to be spectacularly wrong sometimes and, may get you in the wrong way in business magazines and so forth. But you've got a very good chance of being right, and you don't have to waste all the computing energy on trying to figure out what right actually would be. So continuing to focus on the core, I think, is a significant and realistic thing to think about doing. Disruption is distracting. I got into this whole thing where I was doing the alliteration of disruption is. Second thing you might do is, I told you I'd come back to this, which is what the French did with Uber. Right? The Brits are doing it too, but in a sort of more subtle kind of way, and that is that you respond asymmetrically. If you can't change yourself as rapidly as you need to in response to the technological change, you can look for other ways of responding competitively. And I have to say, I don't totally like this. It doesn't seem quite fair, and I usually want to see technologies get introduced because I think ultimately we're all better off. But as a strategy professor, I have to point out that it makes sense to do this kind of stuff. You respond asymmetrically, and they try to come into your market with a new bank, and you go to the regulator and say, they're not safe. We care about public safety in a new way we didn't know until now. Third possibility is that you in effect, delay choice. Now, in order to do that, in order to delay disruption, what you would have to do is invest in two different possible technological futures simultaneously, in the hope and expectation that that you could do that long enough until things became clearer. There is a sort of prominent example of this actually working. When Andy Grove was the head of Intel, there was a transition from CISC, which was complete instruction set computing, to RISC, which was reduced instruction set computing. RISC was cheaper, but nobody was quite sure whether it was going to have the kind of performance that was going to be necessary. And Intel thought it couldn't figure out which one was going to be better. And besides, some people in Intel basically hid a development project from some of top management because they thought they knew the answer and they wanted to work on it, so they did, and they kind of hid it. That happened at Bell Labs in the PBX story too, by the way. So even if you're top management and you choose something, doesn't mean your engineers are listening. And sometimes they're right. So it turned out that Intel invested in both paths and then just followed the one that ended up winning. And so if you can afford it, that's another way to approach these kinds of technological issues. Next thing, I think, is the kind of Silicon Valley, at least headline solution, which is the idea that you would disrupt yourself. And here we got a quote from the late Steve Jobs: "If we don't cannibalize ourselves, somebody else will." And so the idea is, if there's going to be a disruptive technology that wipes out our existing business, we may as well own it. Yeah. Now, that is easier to say than it is to actually do. If you try to do that stuff inside your existing operating units, almost certainly the guys who are responsible for delivering profits from the existing business will one way or another kill those guys. They'll take all the resources away from them. Or, even if they don't mean to kill them, they'll kill them with procedures. They'll kill them with slow decision processes, with strict budgets that can't be changed when circumstances change, with slow response times and so forth, with a culture in general that is different than the one you need to move quickly. And so if you're going to try to do this, you almost certainly need to put them in separate operating units. But if you think it's going to happen anyway, then you may as well disrupt yourself. My last one is a little happier, and that is that you can disrupt others. My shining example of this is Telenor, which is the Norwegian telecommunications companies. It, of course, because of rapid technological change in the mobile computing industry, faces all kinds of threats itself. One of the things that I like that it has done is that it has decided that one of the things it'll do is go and disrupt somebody else's market. And so Telenor has invested and become a fintech banker in several countries now. There's a big one in Pakistan, I understand. INSEAD has written a case about the one in Serbia, and so Telenor has gone and disrupted somebody else. There's no reason that as an incumbent you can't be the disruptor of somebody else's market, and that's a potentially interesting thing to do. So that is the digital disruption story that I have chosen to try to talk to you about tonight. What I hope I have done is given you a better insight into what disruption is meant to be, what the evidence is for it, why it is a useful theory in and of itself, in that it helps us structure our thinking and our expectations, but also why it's incomplete, and why 70 or 100 years of difficult and rude surprises around what technological change is going to end up doing to existing industry structures is still likely to continue to surprise us in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jones.